Thank you very much. I have prepared my presentation in English, so I will switch to English.
As it was introduced, the topic of my research is the changes of the image and urban identity of Vanadzor in the context of post-industrial transformations of the city. The Soviet period in the history of Armenia was accompanied of new cities and the development of social engineering and municipal infrastructures in cities. Vanadzor, the third largest city in the Republic of Armenia, the administrative, economic and cultural center of Lori province, stands out among those cities. Vanadzor was known as Harakilisa and its foundation during the days of the Russian Empire. Following the Sovietization of Armenia, the city was named Kirovakan in 1935 after the Russian Bolshevik leader Sergei Kirov. In the Soviet years, Kirovakan ranked second after the capital in terms of industrial potential. Kirovakan, like other newly founded cities in the USSR, were oriented towards specific narrow economic goals and objectives and were more connected to the industries and cities of the former Soviet republics than concentrated on the local economy. This created a serious imbalance in the spatial development of Armenia, limiting the adaptation opportunities of cities after the collapse of the United Economic Complex of the USSR. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, a similar fate befell Kirovakan, all industrial establishments of which stopped their operations, causing the city to scramble, finding new economic bases to build the development on. The city also suffered from the Spitak earthquake, the Artsakh War, and the difficult socio-economic situation. After the collapse of the USSR, urbanization rates dropped in Armenia, which was a result of mass out-migration of population and decrease of natural growth. Vanadzor has also experienced and still is undergoing population decline. Over a couple of decades, Vanadzor has been struggling to find new economic bases for the development of the city and make their urban infrastructure more attractive for investments. Post-communist cities of the Republic of Armenia can be considered as cities under transformation, since the urban landscapes formed during Soviet period are being adapted and remodeled to new conditions shaped by the economic, political, and cultural transition to capitalism. In 1993, Kirovakan was renamed Vanadzor, and while the formal remodeling of the institutional landscape of the city has now been largely completed in post-communist Vanadzor, some social cultural practices and structures still retain some socialist features. And Vanadzor still exhibits a typically socialist urban character and thus should be considered as a city in transition. In order to understand and interpret post-communist urban restructuring of Vanadzor, we take into consideration the interactions between three aspects of post-communist transition suggested by Sikora and Bozarovsky. The institutional transformations that created a general societal framework for transition, transformations of the social, economic, cultural, and political practices exhibited in the everyday life of people, and the transformation dynamics of urban change. In the case of Vanadzor in particular, post-communist institutional transformations were marked by basic reforms of the political system, resulting in democratic elections at the local level and the decentralization of power to local governments and privatization of state assets. Secondly, the emergence of a number of new private owners, entrepreneurs and firms, and the openness of local economic systems have formed the basic conditions for the spontaneous emergence of series of economic, social, and cultural transformations in Vanadzor. Political, economic, social, and cultural transformations and the post-industrial new conditions also stimulate the creation of new post-communist urban landscapes of Vanadzor, which become symbolic manifestations of the future city. The Soviet cities were designed to glorify the ideas of communism, and the authorities made efforts to construct relevant urban identities by artificially enhancing and silencing some aspects of already existing identities. After the collapse of the USSR, cities are once again rethinking their identities. The process is problematic and often contradictory, as it takes place under political, cultural, and economic transition, and involves different actors like globalization processes, national and regional governments, city administration, urban activists, and ordinary citizens. The post-Soviet cities, including Vanadzor, faced the task of rethinking the Soviet past, recognizing spatial identities and setting new goals for the development of the city through intra-city dialogue. In the post-Soviet years, Kirovakan was renamed Vanadzor. Most of the city streets, squares, and parks were renamed. The city's architectural and symbolic landscapes were changed, and the local authorities regularly work on rebuilding the image of the city. However, we argue that the buildings of abandoned factories that remind the citizens of the industrial glory of Kirovakan, the Soviet nostalgia, the remnants of the Soviet urban identity in Kirovakan, the lack of prospects for economic development of the city, the difficult social situation deepen the crisis of urban identity of Vanadzor. In recent years, the practices of presenting new economic basis for the city development and reshaping the image of the city by the local authorities is in constant conflict with the ideas and expectations of the residents of Vanadzor. Therefore, in this research, we found it expedient to view the changes of Vanadzor's urban identity and the image of the city in interaction between public and official discourses and the transformation dynamics of urban change. Urban identity is a social cultural construct formed as a result of socialization and adaptation in a certain territorial settlement and is determined by the assimilation and reproduction of cultural symbols, accepted norms, traditions, lifestyle of the inhabitants of this settlement. Urban identity is the result of identifying a person with an urban community as a large social group that differs from a number of other communities identified on the basis of urban affiliation. In some, urban identity is formed as a result of identifying a person with a specific urban community and is determined by assimilation and reproduction of the symbolic capital of the city, social norms and lifestyle that unite the inhabitants of the given city. The formation of urban identity is influenced by three types of factors. First of all, the stable factors: the location of the city, the climate, the history of the city. Second, the changing factors: the size and population of the city, the urban landscape of the city, the quality of life of the residents, the cultural traditions of the local community. The third are the symbolic factors: the symbols of the city, the political atmosphere, the cultural codes of conduct of the inhabitants, the significant events, etc. Special attention should be paid to the symbolic factors of urban identity, among which we will single out the image of the city and the symbol of the city. The symbol of the city is a certain object which is associated with the city and is the first thing that comes to mind when thinking about the city. The image of the city is a system of interconnected and interacting signs, symbols, archetypes, and stereotypes that quite simply and at the same time vividly characterize any given territory. The description of the image of the city includes information with a certain emotional and axiological assessment of the features of the geographical position and architecture, history of development, specialization of the city, customs of citizens, notable events, mention of the city and or its inhabitants in the history of country or region. When forming the image of the city, a special urban lexicon is also formed. Words that most clearly characterize the territory, names of people, toponyms, historical and cultural events, memorable places, etc. As a rule, the urban lexicon thickens, concentrates the most important figurative points. With the framework of our research, we will view the changes of the changing and symbolic factors of urban identity formation of Vanadzor in the interaction of official and public discourses. In the last 3 years, we have examined the last 3 development programs of Vanadzor presented by the local authorities, the speeches of the representatives of the municipality of Vanadzor, the books published with community funds, and other official data. Expert interviews were conducted with Vanadzor Mayor Mamikon Aslanyan, the secretary of the municipality, and other representatives of local authorities. The familiarity of the urban environment consists of architectural and symbolic landscapes of the city. and its elements can be used to reshape local urban identities, which is why after the collapse of the USSR, the city authorities of Kirovakan started the process of reshaping the symbolic landscape of the city in order to outline the perspective of the post-Soviet development of the city. The onset of post-communism was marked by a struggle against the primary symbols of the Soviet past. As in all other post-Soviet republics, in Armenia as well, the collapse of the Soviet Union was followed by the so-called war against Soviet memory. The war started by renaming public spaces and the removal of statues of communist figures. The city of Kirovakan wasn't left out of the process of rethinking the Soviet past and rebuilding local identity. The city was renamed Vanadzor, and the statue of Kirov was removed from the main square of the city. Researchers Young and Light introduced three possible scenarios of identity building in different post-communist cities, each shaped by different national contexts of the experience of socialism and post-socialism. According to them, post-communism identity building may either draw on pre-socialist golden ages as their key source of identity and seek to conceal the socialist past, or draw on the history of the socialist period, but use it more as part of emphasizing their anti-communist credentials, or may actively include some elements socialist past is highly contested ways in their contemporary identity formation. In the case of Vanadzor, as we see, we are dealing with the first scenario. The symbols of the Soviet past are almost completely replaced by the symbols of the Armenian heroic past, and the prominent figures presenting the golden age in the history of Armenian culture. Kirov Square was renamed Haik Square, Lenin Avenue was renamed Tigran the Great Avenue, Mark Street became Grigor Lusavorish Street, Kirov Street was renamed Moses Khorenatsi, and etc. A similar practice was used in the process of renaming the post-Soviet Yerevan, Yerevan's landscape, as it was introduced in Professor Abramian's works. Almost all Soviet symbols have disappeared from Vanadzor's urban landscape, and old and new parks, squares, and streets continue to be named after old and new figures of Armenian culture. Chemical Factory Workers' Park was recently French-Armenian cultural and public figure Charles Aznavour, and the Railway Worker Park was named after writer Grant Matevosyan, and the Youth Park was renamed Ruben Sevak Park. However, these changes were superficial, and they just copied the practices of other cities of the Republic of Armenia, without tending to formulate a local urban identity, as the social and economic feature of the city was remaining uncertain in the official discourse. The commercialization of the city center, the practices of renting public spaces in Vanadzor to local prominent businessmen spoke of the lack of a city development ideas. Along with all this, the residents of the city continued to reproduce the Soviet urban identity, which was conditioned by the difficult socio-economic situation, the presence of the former industrial ghost of the city in the architectural landscape of the Vanadzor, and nostalgia of good life. As a result, in the urban lexicon, the city is still called Kirovakan. The residents call themselves Kirovakansi and kept demanding that the city authorities restore the city's industrial potential. One of the bright examples of the post-industrial Vanadzor's urban identity crisis is the issue around the symbolic landscape of the main Haik Square of the city. During the Soviet period, the square was known as Kirov Square, and the statue of the prominent Bolshevik was standing at the center of the square until the independence of Armenia. Immediately after the collapse of the USSR, the statue of Kirov was removed from the center of the city. The square was renamed Haik. However, the main square of Vanadzor remains without the symbol to this day. After the war against Soviet monuments, main squares and cities of several Armenian cities have been left without symbols, which indicates that getting rid of the symbols of the Soviet past was an easier task for the city authorities than replacing the vacated areas with new symbols. The issue of replacing these vacant areas with new symbols is a subject of serious public debates. which isn't accidental at all, as the displaced monument may continue to mark its former place. In the case of Vanadzor's High Square, there are rumors from time to time about placing a new statue in the square, and city authorities have held public hearings in the past years, but no final decision has been made yet. In 2004, the former mayor of Vanadzor, Samvel Darpinyan, announced that a statue of a politician will not be placed in the main square of Vanadzor. Later, there was suggestions to place the statue of Haik Nahapet and Tigran the Great, as well as Hovannes Tumanyan in the square. In the case of the latter two, on the condition of adequate renaming of the square. If in the case of the first two, we are dealing with the symbols of national and not a local identity, then in the case of Tumanyan, the public hearings pointed out that local heritage of the great Armenian poet, considering him an important symbol in a local identity building process. A couple of representatives of the city authorities even suggested to rename the city after Tumanyan. According to the modernization program of High Square of Vanadzor, the Lori Regional Administration and the Vanadzor municipality planned to build a unique clock tower, as you see. The project hasn't been implemented yet, leaving the main square of the city without symbol. Public discourse on the symbolic reshaping of the main square of the city is also ambiguous. Part of the city's population still regrets that the Kirov statue was removed altogether, saying it was part of the city's history, a wonderful architectural work that would remind of the good old days of the city. Some of our respondents thought that instead of new statue, the city should have new jobs. Some of the respondents were in favor of the idea of placing the statue of Hovannes Tumanyan. The issue of the fate of chemical factory workers' park is more controversial. The park was recently renamed after Charles Aznavour. The park is currently in a dilapidated condition, but within the framework of the government's subsidy program, it will be rebuilt in the coming years. However, most of our respondents were against the renaming of the park, noting that thanks to the chemical factory, the city became a city, and that instead of changing the history of the city authorities should be thinking about reviving it, reopening factories, providing people with jobs. In parallel with the practices of symbolic changes in urban landscape of Vanadzor by the city authorities, we have registered an initiative by young residents of Vanadzor aimed at reproducing the architectural and symbolic landscapes of the city and old toponyms of Kirovakan and its outskirts by creating posts and illustrations on Facebook pages and making animated stickers. There are also pages on social networks that regularly publish pictures of Soviet Kirovakan within old toponyms of the city districts. And in the comment sections of these pages, we observe the practice of reproduction of the Soviet local lexicon of the city. All these examples show that the post-Soviet symbolic transition from Kirovakan to Vanadzor was mainly carried out with the use of classical approach of symbolic and identity reconstruction, imitating the practices of other cities of Republic, while the formation of local urban identity is still in transition and is a vital subject of a public discourse. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, city authorities of Vanadzor, without obvious success, are trying to find new economic bases to build the development on and make the urban structures of the city more competitive and attractive for investments, as well as for the residents of Vanadzor. Over the past 10 years, the development strategies of the city of Vanadzor have begun to dispel the illusion of restoration of the industrial potential of the city and made information technology, light industry, and tourism the key areas of the city's future plans. In expert interviews made during our field research, the mayor of Vanadzor and number of representatives of the local authorities clarified that the city finally abandoned the project of reviving the city's industrial potential, and that the city should strive to become the center of tourism of the northern regions of the Republic of Armenia. During the Soviet period, Vanadzor was an industrial city. The population worked in factories, and this was the main area of employment for the population. However, in addition to the factories and plants, there was also a well-developed leisure infrastructure. Apart from the camps and ski slopes, the surrounding forests, the nearby natural monuments and monasteries were also of tourist and leisure interest. According to the new city authorities, the city of Vanadzor should abandon its industrial image and perspectives, and should start a new process of rethinking the future and image of the city. According to the city authorities, the city should take the path of developing the tourism infrastructure. The first steps in the direction were taken on the initiative of the former Prime Minister of Republic of Armenia, Garik Atanesyan, when the tourist development strategy of the city was developed. The current city authorities also believe that tourism can save Vanadzor and turn it into a tourist center of northern Armenia. Mild climatic conditions, the presence of large forests, and geographical location are possible preconditions for Vanadzor to become a tourist city. Despite the fact that the official discourse have already outlined the prospects for the development of the city, and a process has begun to reshaping the image of the city, a number of parks of Vanadzor have been rehabilitated, funds of government subsidy programs and other projects. New tourist routes are being developed to the historical and cultural sites of the city to become attractive for tourists. Vanadzor still doesn't have the necessary infrastructure to become an attractive tourist destination in the region. In addition, a similar strategy has been developed and presented by the local authorities of Dilijan and Yerevan, which are ahead of Vanadzor in terms of infrastructure and tourist attractiveness. The majority of our respondents do speak in favor of creating any jobs in the city, but generally are against the new approaches and think that the city authorities should try to save the existing factories first, because Kirovakan was an industrial city. That's their history, and the new city will not be their city anymore. Only a part of our young respondents was in favor of the changes, but mainly referring to the development prospects of the technology center opened in Vanadzor. Some of the respondents accused the city authorities of making the city for others, meaning the tourists, pointing out that the municipality is improving the city's parks and streets for tourists and not for the residents of the city. In this case, we are dealing with a clash of rethinking the images of my city and our city in the public discourse, with the idea of our city in the official discourse. In sum, we can argue that the practices of the city authorities of Vanadzor to rethink the urban identity of the city in the face of the uncertainty of the city's future and hard socio-economic realities are still inferior to the Soviet industrial urban identity of Kirovakan in public discourse. The Soviet nostalgia for the good life, the presence of ghosts of the industrial past in the architectural landscape of the city, and the lack of certainty of the future of the city in the symbolic landscape are still a big factor in the reproduction of the city's Soviet urban identity. As a result, certain projects of urban development and processes of rethinking the image of Vanadzor do not correspond to the public perceptions of the restructuring of the city. The city authorities accuse the residents of clinging to the past, and the residents accuse the authorities of forgetting the past. Thus, the two important actors responsible for building an urban identity in the post-socialist Vanadzor still continue to act separately in the ongoing process of urban identity rethinking. Thank you.